My name is Hank Klibanoff, and it's a great pleasure to be here. As you heard, I did have 35 years in journalism. And not every day at the Globe, which was part of that time, suggested that I would have such a good career in journalism. 6 different cities, a career in which I was fortunate, as you heard, to be co-author of a Pulitzer Prize-winning book. And I say that in total astonishment all these years later. It was a book on the influence of journalism and awakening America to its vicious racial discrimination. I had no special genius that qualified me to be a journalist. I had learned to write fairly well, and I had endless curiosity. When I was 6, and my kindergarten teacher wrote my parents to say that I was ready for first grade, she began by saying, he started the year being kind of funny and silly and goofy, but he really got serious as the year went on. And she says, I have observed that he has made no great effort to mix socially and play activities on the playground, but has shown a desire to follow me around, talking about things, asking questions. Now, I ask you, is that not a perfect job description for a reporter? The best candidate for this job is someone who has shown a desire to follow people around, talk about things, and ask questions. So with a bachelor's degree in English and a master's in journalism, I landed a job at a daily newspaper on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Suddenly, I held the keys to journalism heaven and a license to do what I do best, which is to annoy people with my questions, okay? And, when called out for being too persistent, my defense was very clear and very noble. I'm just trying to get the truth. My introduction to newspapers had been through the sports section of my hometown paper in Alabama, but in time, when reading the sports section, my eyes would drift over to the news sections and then to page 1, where I couldn't help but encounter, in Alabama, all these stories about racial crises, about racial discrimination, about police brutality. And I would get an even heavier dose of news when I began delivering a newspaper, the Birmingham News, in 1963, the spring of my 9th grade in my hometown of Florence, Alabama. And I could not help but form judgments on the news stories and how these newspapers handled them. So in April and May of 1963, and some of you will know this history, the most graphic and riveting photographic images that were being sent out all across the world were of the large, snarling dogs attacking black protesters and cannon-like fire hoses pummeling black demonstrators on the streets of Birmingham. It was inconceivable that the police commissioner, Bull Connor, could unleash such unholy terror against these innocent people, and particularly children. It led every national and international newspaper across the country and television news programs. It was the dominant news everywhere, except one place, Birmingham. The Birmingham Post-Herald, the morning paper, and the Birmingham News, the afternoon paper, which I'm rolling up and getting my hands all ink stained, putting a rubber band around and putting it into the basket of my bicycle and getting ready to kick up the kickstand and go off and do it. Neither of these newspapers saw the dogs and the hoses attacking people as front page news. Now, I'm a mere 14 years old. I'm not all that particularly bright or anything like that, but I can see it in my own hometown paper, which is publishing 2.5 hours north, that it's on page 1 of my hometown paper. It's over all the news, and it's not in the Birmingham papers, okay? So it was an incredible decision by these 2 newspapers that even a 14-year-old boy could understand represented bad news judgment, pure, unethical news judgment, a colossal ethical misjudgment, and a powerful lesson in journalistic cowardice. It seeped in, and it still stays there. By September of that year, things didn't get better. The Ku Klux Klan bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church and killed those 4 little girls, as you know. The newspaper by then made a course correction. It had come under such criticism that they did put that on page 1. They would have to. Well, sometimes I have to tell you also, reading the newspapers in those days made me feel stupid, okay? I couldn't understand some of these stories. Stories from Washington, D.C. about Supreme Court decisions would go something like this. The U.S. Supreme Court yesterday refused to deny an Alabama civil rights organization's effort to overturn a Birmingham City Commission decision to reject the organization's repeated attempts to stage a protest march over city objections, yada, 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 okay? Well, I can tell you, there was nothing inaccurate about that lead, okay? But there's also nothing comprehensible about it, right? Who won? Who lost? Well, over the years, as I became a newspaper writer, I had a life-altering epiphany. And if you've not had one of those in life, and maybe it awaits you, okay? And be open for it, okay? And that epiphany, and it guides my teaching today, was that while I indeed might be stupid, okay, my inability to understand those stories was because of sloppy reporting and careless writing. And the corollary hit me with the force of a tank. The most important thing I could achieve as a young journalist was to become a clear writer. And so I went on to teach that in newsrooms and later in classrooms. And from there, I came to see that the single most important part of the process to produce clearly written stories is reporting, research. When I say, as I'm sure that I have on more than one occasion, and that journalism is the pursuit of truth. Could we have a little John Philip Sousa for this, you know? The pursuit of truth. Even I feel a little ickiness in my throat, okay? Of course, if a student wrote that in a paper, I'm going to write one word off to the right. Cliché! Exclamation point. But why do I feel awkward in saying truth? Because it sounds so vainglorious. But I'm getting at something when I say that, and here's what it is. And this is from my own experience in newsrooms all across this country, no matter how many or how few there are. Journalists, no matter how many or how few of them there are working extraordinarily hard to find out and verify the truth of whatever it is they're reporting on. That commitment to verification has been the hallmark of the work ethic in every newsroom I've been privileged to work for, and most of them I haven't been privileged to work for. Verification might mean determining whether there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It might simply be making sure everyone knows that the city council meeting tomorrow night has been moved from 7 p.m. to 6 p.m. And boy, you get that wrong, in a town that cares, you got a problem on your hands. There's a standard reporting verification process of every small item, from publishing wrong street names to wrong translations of sensitive statements, from assessing the honesty of a city councilman's expense reports, to the rationale for a president's executive order. Journalists learn from the very first day the importance of getting it right. Now, sometimes we learn the hard way through the humiliation of getting it wrong. So here I have to tell you a story. When I was across the street at the Boston Globe, one early lesson came to me the day after an editor had come up to me in the newsroom. "Are you up, Klibanoff?" I said, "Excuse me?" When he says, "Are you up?" I thought he meant, "Are you available for lunch?" I said, "Oh, yes, sir." But no, he meant, "Are you available to take on a story?" And so he shoves me, he says, "All right, we do this for the front page graphic. It's saying everyone's got to move their clocks from standard to daylight savings, okay? And I need you to write that up, okay? You got it?" I mean, could there be a more unremarkable story, right, to be assigned, right? I mean, there are only two possibilities, right? Before you go to sleep, you either move the clock forward or you move it backward before you go to sleep, right? I mean, who in the world could ever get that wrong? Back then, new and on the make at a big city newspaper, I could never admit to the editor that I had confusion about the assignment, okay? I mean, when someone says, "Oh, come on," when someone says, "You move the clock forward," or "We're moving the meeting forward a day," does forward mean outward, away from you, from where we are at that moment? Or does it mean moving it forward, meaning moving it inward, closer to the date we're at in that moment? Okay? So that mistake, published in how many thousands and thousands of newspapers that landed on the doorsteps of Bostonians, was one of my more ignominious bouts with the truth. And I lost. My more persistent and consistent memories of my years in journalism are not those errors, but they are the many, many long nights, well after everyone else had gone home, of staying alone past 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock in the Daily Herald newsroom, an afternoon paper on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, or later in the press room under the dome of the Mississippi State Capitol, doing one thing, trying to get it right. Reporting, verifying, getting it right. Running the campaign finance numbers again and again. Reading and rereading, taking copious notes from records of a corrupt longshoremen's union. Or taking the 120 pages of parchment penitentiary spending records that I had received from the state auditor. Or was it 420 pages? And counting and recounting the amount of state funds that had been illegally siphoned off to the private, segregated, all-white academies in the Mississippi Delta. I just learned that that's what it takes. And not because I was, had some, magnanimous heart. It's that I didn't want to embarrass the hell out of myself again, like I had once before, okay? So in many ways, the best work in journalism is still done in that painstaking way, with computer assistance, of course. But no journalist of consequence would take the output of a data processing computer and throw it into a news story unchecked by human eyes and unpressure tested by human brain-powered thought processes and sensibilities. Verification is and must remain the essential key to any research and reporting before the writing begins. Can a machine do that? Can AI? Not as good as we can, okay? I am of a generation that distinctly remembers the film 2001, A Space Odyssey, when a spacecraft too reliant on a computer named HAL discovers that HAL is not quite the team player they thought he was. So, to quote another famous president, former President Ronald Reagan, we trust, but we verify, okay? So, I want to talk about something else that has changed in the lifetime of many of you here, and has changed even more dramatically, I would say, in the last 20 years, okay? In my first job in Mississippi in 1972, okay, in case you were wondering, right? I was assigned to cover a murder trial that had created a lot of news copy and a lot of controversy before I had arrived on the scene. The editor pulled me aside and he cautioned me to keep my stories objective. That was the magic word back then. He suggested that after a lead, the first paragraph of a story that summarized each day's testimony, that I alternate paragraph by paragraph between something favorable to the prosecution side to something favorable to the defense side, then prosecution, then defense. I mean, that to him was balance. Now, we've all watched enough trials on television to know trials do not unfold that way. That's not the way it goes. The prosecution might be leading holding the court for a week and a half before the defense gets a chance. I mean, they can cross-examine witnesses, but the bulk of their case is not going to come till later. And so you cannot formulate that kind of a strategy and have your readers every day make sense of what the heck's really going on there. So he was worried about the form of the story more than the function. And he was asking for coverage that really might have nothing to do with what happened in the courtroom. Now, how would a machine handle that? How would AI? Now, if you wonder sometimes, well, whatever happened to that thing about objectivity? Where did it go? Where did giving both sides of the story go? It was abandoned as irrelevant to both the art and the science of journalism years and years ago. Now, journalists, hear me please, journalists absolutely must be painstakingly fair and accurate, and it takes a lot of work. It means going to the defense attorney his case it won't come on for another week and say, what did you get out of today's testimony, and how are you going to counter that? So you can say in the next day's paper, the defense is expected to counter that, yada, yada, yada. And that's where you try to get your balance, okay? There's no virtue in stories that force balance where there is none. In fact, it's been decades since the standard code of ethics, the boilerplate code of ethics by the Society of Professional Journalists, abandoned objectivity as a goal. Now, that might surprise you. I didn't say they abandoned accuracy or fairness, just this objectivity. It's a false imposition I'm going to try to explain. Why? Because that's what got us Joe McCarthy, the bullying U.S. senator from Wisconsin back in the 40s and the 50s, who branded good people in government, in the academy, in Hollywood, and newspapers as communists. The mandate for objectivity is what handcuffed reporters from challenging McCarthy, thus allowing him to go unrestrained for months and months, damaging the careers and lives of good people in the process. Now, what you've seen in the last 50 years is a much more liberated press that comes out ready to take on those challenges of people who will lie, okay? And that, for the most part, has been a good thing. It has made the coverage of wars in which the U.S. is a contender more honest, from Vietnam to Iraq and beyond. It's made coverage of government and politics more honest. When I was reading papers as a teenager, I don't ever recall in a sentence that would quote the president or a senator or a congressman make an assertion, followed by another sentence that would say, the senator again offered no evidence in support of his claim, and virtually every known study released on the matter has contradicted his claim. It wouldn't put that in there back then. Now it's in there all the time, if it's true, okay? So you see more of that, and I think that's a good thing when it's backed up by rigorous reporting. Now, the topic, the future of media. Oops, oh gosh, I'm so sorry, we're out of time. I've got to run. My answer is that I don't know, okay? So who would know the future? I asked ChatGPT, okay? Honestly, I did 2 tests. One was just, I'm a former reporter. I'm going to be speaking to a group of, alumni, and so what can I tell them? And I got one answer, and it was pablum, palaver, platitudes, not rendered nearly as poetically as what I just said, okay? I also did another one that said the same thing, but I added, I also played on the Boston Celtics in the Larry Bird years, okay? And the answer that I got back was, well, given your multiple talents and careers, and as a professional basketball player and as a journalist, and then went on and gave me the same answer, okay? All right. So I don't want to inflict all that on you, my ignorance about the future. I just wouldn't be a fair predictor. I have to confess to you, I get 3 newspapers thrown on my driveway every single morning, okay? Print newspapers, okay? So I'm still in the old school, although I read online a lot, of course, But I do have one concern that I want to share with you. And I've added this to this talk today because I was really worried that I was being too light, a little too comedic about some things, when this really is a serious question, okay? And it's more serious now than I ever remember it being in my lifetime. I have a concern, and it grows. I wonder what happens to our American news media should the U.S. government move towards an authoritarian regime. What are we going to do after November if we move toward an authoritarian regime? Now, I worry at 2 levels, because authoritarians historically target who first? The press and the academy, okay? And you can look in our lifetime at those who we have seen do it. I was teaching the killing fields in my class the other day about the Pol Pot regime and the Khmer Rouge. And that's what happens, okay? And we've seen it again and again. And so let's just keep that in mind. I don't want you to think he just took crack jokes all night, but we do have a serious problem, and we have to protect and be prepared, I think, to protect the press and the freedoms that we want it to enjoy. So, I only have one more thing to say. As my fellow Alabamian, Forrest Gump, would say, and that's all I'm going to say about that.